The rain lashed against the towering glass windows of my Chicago apartment, streaking them with water that blurred the city lights beyond. It was the kind of storm that made people grateful to be indoors, wrapped in warmth and security. I should have felt that way. Instead, I sat frozen at my desk, my breath shallow, my heart hammering against my ribs as my eyes remained locked on the glowing screen of my phone. A single message, that was all it had taken to shatter everything. ATM just sent another $3,500. Keep the gravy train running. The words seemed almost absurd at first. I read them once, then again, my mind fumbling for an explanation that might soften their meaning. But before I could even attempt to rationalize, another message followed. Ethan, tell her we need medical help again. She always falls for that one. A sharp electric jolt ran through my body. My stomach lurched, nausea rising in my throat. I knew what I was looking at. I just couldn't believe it. This wasn't some stranger exploiting me. This was my family, Walter and Diane, my parents, the people I had spent years supporting, believing they had nowhere else to turn. The people I had sacrificed for, given up vacations for, worked late nights for. And Ethan, my brother, my own blood. A mistake. It had to be a mistake. I grasped for explanations, but there was none. I had spent 6 years wiring them thousands of dollars each month, believing they were struggling. They had painted a desperate picture. Medical bills they couldn't cover, utility bills that threatened to cut off their heat, repairs for a furnace that was always mysteriously breaking in the dead of winter. I had given, again and again. And now I was staring at undeniable proof that my generosity had been nothing more than a running joke. I scrolled up, my fingers numb against the screen. It was worse than I imagined. Messages littered through their private conversations, mocking me, laughing at me. My father boasting about upgrading his golf clubs with the money I sent for his heart medication. My mother reminding Ethan that I was too soft-hearted to question them, that I would always put family first, and Ethan, who had called me in tears after claiming Mom and Dad were drowning in debt. Ethan, who had always played the part of the concerned brother, urging me to help just one more time. Something inside me snapped. The room seemed to tilt, a cold, hollow ache spreading through my chest. I felt foolish. More than that, I felt used. For years, I had lived under the illusion that I was the glue holding my family together, the lifeline keeping them from falling apart. I had told myself that I was lucky to be in a position where I could help them, that I was doing the right thing. But the reality was far simpler. I wasn't their daughter. I was their income. Outside, the storm intensified, wind howling against the glass, rain hammering like a warning. I had delayed buying my own home so they wouldn't lose theirs. I had skipped vacations, cut corners in my own life, spent sleepless nights working longer hours to ensure they had everything they needed. And they had been thriving off my sacrifices, not scraping by, not barely making it, thriving. A memory surfaced, unbidden. Last Christmas, my mother sobbing over the phone, saying they couldn't afford their mortgage and were terrified of losing the house. She had sounded so afraid, so vulnerable, that I hadn't even hesitated before wiring them $10,000. The guilt had gnawed at me afterward, wondering if it had been enough. 2 weeks later, Ethan had posted a picture from a ski trip. They had all gone. I had seen the photo, but I had ignored it, told myself it must have been an old memory, resurfacing on social media. I had wanted to believe it. Now I knew the truth. They had been laughing at me the whole time. The betrayal didn't just cut deep, it shattered me. I waited, staring at my phone, expecting, hoping for a follow-up message, some frantic attempt at damage control, a lie, an excuse, something. The group chat remained silent. They knew. They knew I had seen it. The pounding on the door cut through the silence, jarring me from my thoughts. I had been sitting in the same spot for what felt like hours, my phone still clenched in my hand. The damning text messages glowing on the screen. The rain had intensified outside, sheets of water blurring the city skyline, turning the world into a haze of motion and light. My mind felt much the same, fragmented, unable to fully grasp the enormity of what I had just uncovered. I already knew who was at the door before I stood. Ethan. He had realized his mistake, had seen my name in the group chat, and now he was here, probably ready with an excuse, a flimsy explanation to smooth things over. I moved slowly toward the entrance, my body tense, my breath steady but shallow. I hesitated for a brief moment, fingers hovering over the handle, then yanked the door open. There he was, drenched from the rain, shoulders hunched, his hood pulled up as if that could shield him from the consequences of his actions. His face, pale and drawn, was filled with something that might have been remorse, but I wasn't sure if it was for what he had done or simply for getting caught. He was desperate. I could see it in the way he shifted from foot to foot, in the way his lips parted, as though searching for the right words. But I wasn't interested in hearing them. I had already seen the truth, and there was no spinning it into something palatable. I let him talk. Or rather, I let the words spill out of him, a frantic mess of half-explanations, attempts to downplay what had happened. He said he never meant for it to be this way. He said he had just gone along with it because he didn't want to be caught in the middle. He tried to justify the messages, tried to tell me that Mom and Dad had needed help, that things had just spiraled over time. Over $250,000. That's how much I had funneled into their accounts over the past 6 years. Every month, without fail, I had sent money, believing I was keeping them afloat, believing I was giving them a chance to breathe after a lifetime of struggling. I had sacrificed for them, worked longer hours, turned down vacations, delayed things I wanted for myself, all because I had believed in the story they had fed me. And yet, while they had cried to me about overdue medical bills and rising rent, they had been spending my money on luxuries. The most damning of all, the beach house, a second home, purchased while I was under the impression they were barely scraping by. Ethan's silence when I confronted him with that fact was deafening. He hadn't even tried to deny it. That was when I knew, deep in my bones, that this hadn't been a misunderstanding. This hadn't been a moment of weakness or desperation. This had been intentional, a carefully orchestrated manipulation to ensure that I never questioned why my help was always needed. And Ethan had been part of it. It wasn't just about the money. It was about how they saw me. I wasn't their daughter. I wasn't their sister. I was their resource. An investment they had nurtured just enough to keep the funds coming. When I pushed Ethan further, when I asked why they had done this, his face crumpled, and he admitted the final unforgivable truth. They had told him to keep me emotionally invested, to make sure I never questioned them, to make sure I felt obligated. It was like a punch to the gut. I had spent years believing I was the anchor keeping my family from drowning, but I had been nothing more than their lifeline to an easier life. They had counted on my kindness, on my sense of duty, on my unwavering belief in family. They had weaponized my love against me, and I had let them. Something inside me shifted then, a slow, creeping realization that this would never stop unless I made it stop. They would always find new emergencies, new reasons, new ways to tug at my guilt. If I let them, they would drain me until there was nothing left. Ethan was still talking, still trying to reason with me, but I wasn't listening anymore. The decision had already been made. I stepped back, severing whatever thread of obligation remained between us. I told him to leave. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel guilty for putting myself first. He looked at me, stunned, as if he had never considered this possibility, as if he had always believed I would forgive, that I would cave, that I would understand, but I didn't. I closed the door, feeling the weight of years of manipulation begin to lift. I wasn't their safety net anymore. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. My path forward was clear. I was cutting them off completely. I sat at my desk, my laptop open, fingers poised over the keyboard. The documents I had ignored for years, bank statements, wire transfers, insurance policies, were all in front of me now, exposing the intricate web of financial dependency I had unknowingly created. It was methodical, almost clinical, the way I severed each tie. The first step was halting the direct deposits into my parents' joint account. Every month, without fail, $3,500 had left my account, funneling straight into theirs. That stopped today. The next step was dealing with the hidden retirement fund, a fund I had secretly built for them, assuming they would need it as they got older. I had been preparing for their future while they had been robbing me blind. With a few clicks, I initiated the closure. The balance, a significant sum, would be redirected back to me, where it belonged. Then my health insurance. 2 years ago, my mother had insisted that my father's condition was worsening, that without my premium coverage, he wouldn't be able to afford his medications. A lie. Another carefully woven deception to keep me tethered. I removed them both as dependents, ensuring they would no longer have access to my benefits. And finally, my life insurance. It had never crossed my mind that they were my primary beneficiaries, that if something happened to me, they would inherit everything. For years, I had told myself I was their protector, their provider, but I was none of those things. I had been their mark. I barely had time to process the enormity of what I had just done when my phone buzzed violently on the desk. A sharp vibration, insistent and demanding. Ethan. I didn't want to answer, didn't want to let any of them invade my space for another second, but something made me pick up the phone and read the incoming messages. It was a string of frantic texts, a rushed attempt at regaining control. Mom and Dad were panicking. My father's heart medication had been denied at the pharmacy. They were blaming me. A familiar wave of nausea rolled over me, but it wasn't guilt this time. It was disgust. Even now, their first instinct wasn't to apologize. It wasn't to acknowledge what they had done. It was to demand, to manipulate, to make it my fault that they were suffering the consequences of their own actions. I clenched my jaw, exhaling slowly as I stared at the screen. I had spent so many years falling for their carefully constructed narratives. Every call, every plea, every story of hardship had been designed to keep me tethered, to keep me giving. Not anymore. Instead of responding, I dialed the pharmacy myself. If my father truly needed his medication, I would confirm it firsthand. A polite voice answered, the kind of detached customer service tone that had no idea it was about to destroy whatever remaining thread of sympathy I had left for my family. The truth was worse than I expected. The so-called $500 medication that they had claimed was a matter of life and death. It cost $39. I gripped the edge of my desk so tightly that pain shot up my arm. How many times had they done this? How many times had I wired them money for life-saving medication while they upgraded their cars, booked cruises, and laughed behind my back? A memory surfaced, unbidden, last year during the holidays. My mother had called me in tears, telling me they couldn't afford Christmas gifts, that they didn't even have enough money to buy groceries for the week. I had sent them $5,000 without hesitation. 2 weeks later, I had seen photos of them at a ski resort. They had told me it was an old trip, that they had simply been reminiscing. I had believed them. Every lie, every manipulation, every moment of unquestioning loyalty came rushing back, colliding into a single undeniable reality. They had never needed me to save them. They had needed me to fund their lifestyle. The guilt, the doubt, the deep-rooted sense of obligation that had kept me chained to them for years, it was gone, burned away. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just angry. I wasn't just hurt. I felt something new, power. They had always assumed I would never walk away, that I would always come running, always give in. They had weaponized my love, my generosity, my need to be the responsible one. But they had made one fatal mistake. They had underestimated me. I picked up my phone again, scrolling through the long list of messages from Ethan. His words blurred together. Panic, desperation, attempts to guilt me into reversing what I had done. Not this time. I went to my settings, scrolled down to his number, and without hesitation, I blocked him. Then I did the same for my parents. For the first time in years, no demands, no manipulation, no expectation that I would fix everything, just silence. And in that silence, I found something I hadn't felt in a long time. The silence didn't last long. It started with the emails. At first, they were composed, measured words crafted with care, as though they still believed they could reel me back in with logic, with appeals to my sense of duty. My father wrote first, his message laced with disappointment rather than anger. He didn't demand, not yet. He simply questioned how I could do this, how I could turn my back on the people who had given me life. But as the days passed, the facade of control crumbled. The emails became longer, more frantic, more desperate. Then came the voicemails, filling up my inbox at an alarming rate. My mother sobbed in one, begging me to reconsider, saying she was sick with worry, that my father's blood pressure had skyrocketed from the stress. She said she couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, knowing I had abandoned them. Then came the threats. My father's tone shifted from confusion to fury, from shock to venom. He accused me of being cold, heartless, of throwing my own family away, as if they meant nothing. He told me I would regret this, that one day I would look back and realize I had destroyed my own bloodline, as if they hadn't destroyed me first. I deleted every message, unread, unheard. But they didn't stop. When they realized I wasn't responding, they turned to letters. Handwritten, pages upon pages of accusations and carefully crafted manipulation. My mother reminded me that they had raised me, had sacrificed for me, had done everything for me when I was younger. She wrote about Christmas mornings, about how my father had worked long hours when I was a child, how she had always put my needs first. I should have felt something. Guilt, maybe, nostalgia, a pull toward them. But all I felt was rage, because none of what she wrote changed the truth. None of it erased the years of deception, of using me, of laughing behind my back, while they drained me dry. They wanted me to remember them as struggling parents, as victims. But I had the receipts. I had the proof of what they really were, and I wasn't falling for it again. Then there was Ethan. Unlike my parents, he knew exactly what he had done. He didn't try to guilt me with the past. He didn't pretend this was a misunderstanding. He knew he was caught, and he was desperate. His messages came next, at all hours of the day. At first, they were filled with panic, rapid-fire texts that he must have sent the moment he realized just how much damage I had done. Then he told me the one thing my parents hadn't. The beach house was going into foreclosure. That was when I felt it, the final satisfying click of realization. They had never needed me to survive. Not once. They had needed me to sustain their illusion of wealth. They had been so confident in their control over me that they had built their lives around the assumption that I would never stop paying. And now it was all crashing down. For a brief moment, I considered responding, not to comfort him, not to offer help, but to say one simple thing: this is not my problem anymore. But I didn't send the message. I didn't need to. Instead, I let his words sit there, unread, unopened, a reminder of everything I had freed myself from. I had spent my entire life believing it was my job to fix things, to rescue them, to put their needs before mine. That's what they had trained me to do. And now I was free. I didn't need to save them. I needed to save myself. The weight of it all settled in the moment the chaos quieted. The messages had slowed, the voicemails had dwindled, and the house I had spent years unknowingly financing was slipping through their fingers. For the first time, I was free. And yet, something lingered. It wasn't regret, not for cutting them off, not for reclaiming what was mine, but there was a hollowness and emptiness where something had once existed. I told myself it was relief, that this was just the aftershock of stepping away from something toxic. But the truth was, I was grieving. Not my parents, not Ethan. I was grieving the illusion of what they had been. I sat across from Dr. Carter in the quiet, warmly lit office, my hands clenched in my lap. I listed the facts, the betrayals, the evidence, the financial trail that stretched over years of manipulation. She listened, nodding, absorbing my words, but I could tell she wasn't focusing on the numbers. She wasn't interested in how much I had given them or how methodically they had exploited me. She was focused on what I had lost. The betrayal had been clear, undeniable, but that didn't mean I had escaped unscathed. I had spent my entire life believing I had a family, flawed, maybe even difficult, but still mine. Cutting them off had taken away more than just the financial burden. It had taken away the role I had played in their lives. For so long, I had been the provider. It was my identity, my purpose, the thing that made me feel needed. Even if it had been twisted, even if it had been unfair, it had been a part of me. Now, without it, I was left standing in an empty space where my duty had once been. That was what I had to grieve. Not them, not the people who had used me, manipulated me, mocked me behind my back, but the version of myself I had been when I believed I was doing something good. The grief came in waves. It wasn't the sharp, cutting kind of sadness, but something slower, deeper, like a dull ache in my chest that I couldn't quite shake. I had spent so much time fixing things that I didn't know how to exist without something broken in my hands. Then came the call. At first, I nearly ignored it. The number was unfamiliar, and after weeks of relentless attempts from my parents and Ethan to get through my defenses, I had stopped answering anything I didn't recognize. But something about this one made me pause, made me hesitate just long enough to let curiosity win over instinct. The voice on the other end was one I hadn't heard in years, my uncle, distant, long removed from family functions, a name that had barely been mentioned in passing conversations. He had heard what had happened. The fallout, the accusations, the way my parents had twisted the story, turning themselves into the victims. He wasn't surprised. He had been through it too, decades earlier. Before I had ever been old enough to notice, my father had done the same to him. The guilt trips, the pleas for help, the subtle but relentless pressure to hand over money under the guise of family loyalty. My uncle had refused, drawn the line, and when he had stopped feeding the cycle, he had been cast out. My father had rewritten the story, painted himself as the struggling patriarch, abandoned by an ungrateful brother. The pattern had existed long before me. I hadn't been the first. I had just been the latest in a long line of people he had drained until they were no longer useful. Something inside me shifted. The guilt, the uncertainty, the lingering doubt that had gnawed at me for weeks began to fade. It hadn't been personal, not really. Not some unique betrayal designed just for me. It had been a cycle, one I had finally broken free from. I had spent so long questioning if I had been too harsh, if I had acted out of anger instead of reason. But the truth was clear now. This wasn't about justice. This wasn't about fairness. This was about control. And the moment I had taken it back, my father had discarded me like all the others who had refused to serve his needs. For weeks, I had carried the weight of their accusations, the heavy guilt of knowing they had lost everything. But I hadn't taken anything from them. I had simply stopped giving. And for the first time, that felt like enough. 6 months had passed. 6 months of silence, of clarity, of finally learning what it meant to live for myself. I had spent years believing my purpose was to keep my family afloat, to sacrifice so they wouldn't have to struggle. But they had never struggled, not in the way they claimed. They had lived off me, built their comforts with my money, laughed behind my back as they drained me dry. Now they had nothing. As I stepped out of the car in front of my apartment building, the weight I had once carried was gone. The guilt had faded, replaced by something stronger, freedom. Then I saw them. Walter and Diane sat slumped on my porch steps, looking smaller than I had ever seen them. Time had caught up with them quickly. My father's once imposing frame was hunched, his clothes noticeably cheaper, his face gaunt where excess had once been. My mother, always so perfectly put together, had lost the effortless grace that wealth had afforded her. The streaks of gray in her hair were no longer hidden, and her coat, thin and worn, was a stark contrast to the furs and designer jackets she had once paraded around in. I didn't need to ask why they were here. I already knew. They had lost everything. The beach house, the country club, the luxuries they had funded through manipulation and deceit. When the money stopped, so did the lifestyle. Ethan had taken them in, just as he had feared, and now they had come to the last place they could turn. I stood for a long moment, just watching them. There was no satisfaction in their downfall, no pleasure in their suffering. Just the cold realization that this was always who they were. They hadn't changed. They had just run out of resources. As I approached, my mother lifted her head first. Her eyes, once sharp and knowing, were pleading now. My father let out a slow, heavy breath, as if summoning the energy for what came next. There was no apology. They spoke of what they had lost, the home, the friendships, the dignity they had once worn like a shield. They told me how hard things had become, how much they had sacrificed these past few months, but they never once acknowledged what they had done to me. Not once did they say they were sorry. Their regret wasn't for the years of lies, the countless ways they had used me. Their regret was for losing their safety net. That was when I knew, without hesitation, that I would never let them back in. They hadn't come to make things right. They had come to see if they could still win. The final blow came when my mother reached for the one tool she had left, guilt. Her voice softened, her body leaned forward, ever so slightly, the way it always did when she needed something. She told me they needed me, but she was wrong. They didn't need me, they needed my money. And there was a difference. I didn't speak, I didn't argue, I didn't offer explanations. I simply turned, stepped inside, and closed the door. For the first time, I didn't feel guilt. I didn't feel the familiar pull of obligation, the instinct to fix what was broken. Savannah's story is a powerful reflection of a reality many people face: financial and emotional manipulation by family. It's easy to believe that helping those we love is always the right thing to do. But when that generosity is exploited, it becomes a cycle of dependence that can drain not just finances, but mental and emotional well-being. In today's world, many individuals struggle with setting boundaries, especially when guilt is used as a weapon. Parents, siblings, or relatives may expect financial support, framing it as a duty rather than a choice. But as Savannah learned, there is a difference between helping someone in need and funding someone's entitlement. The key takeaway from this story is that boundaries are necessary, even with family. No one should feel obligated to sacrifice their own stability for the comfort of others who refuse to take responsibility. If a relationship is built on guilt, manipulation, and financial dependency, it is not love, it is control. Learn to say no without guilt. Recognize toxic patterns early. And most importantly, understand that choosing yourself is not selfish. It is survival. True love and respect are not bought, and anyone who believes otherwise never deserved your sacrifice to begin with. Your worth isn't measured by how much you give, it's in how much you value yourself. Setting boundaries isn't selfish, it's necessary. If this story resonated with you, subscribe for more powerful stories that inspire and empower. See you in the next one.